November 9th, 1926. In the space of seconds, a tornado hurled a schoolhouse 50 feet through the air, leaving 13 children and 4 townspeople dead in La Plata, Maryland, with no warning for anyone inside. Decades later, that trauma shaped a town obsessed with the unseen hooks of every coming storm, searching for signs that might spare them next time. The fury that changed everything is the untold story of how memory, loss, and missed chances collided, first in a silent classroom, then again 76 years later, on what seemed like an ordinary Sunday. Has La Plata truly learned to outpace disaster, or are the same invisible risks about to strike again? At 2:30 in the afternoon, as children traced letters on their slates and teachers moved between rows, a low roar swept in from the southwest. The sky, already darkened, pressed down on the schoolhouse. Then, in a matter of seconds, the windows burst inward. Glass rained across desks. The building began to tremble. 60 children and 2 teachers had no time to run. Some tried. Most simply clung to the nearest hand. According to survivors, the room seemed to lift beneath them. A force, sudden and unseen, wrenched the entire schoolhouse off the ground and hurled it 50 feet into a stand of trees. The aftermath was chaos. 13 children and 4 townspeople lost their lives. Bodies were scattered among broken timbers and splintered desks, some resting far from where the school had stood moments before. Miss Ethel Graves, a young teacher, later described the sensation: a rumbling, a rush of wind, then the feeling of being pulled up by invisible hooks. She recalled seeing children and pieces of the building spinning through the air before she lost consciousness. Bertie Cross, only 3 years old at the time, would later tell of the confusion and the panic, memories that never faded. Rescue efforts began instantly, but there was no plan. Neighbors, parents, and strangers scrambled through the wreckage, carrying injured children to the nearest cars. The town's only doctor worked without rest. For many, the search for missing children lasted until dusk. The sense of loss was overwhelming, but so was the shock. No warning, no chance to prepare, just sudden violence and a silence that settled over La Plata once the wind had passed. For decades, the story echoed through classrooms and town meetings. Names of the lost were etched on plaques and spoken at school assemblies. The memory of that day became a kind of weather in itself, always present, always shaping how the town looked at darkening skies and distant thunder. Inside the foyer of Milton M. Summers Middle School, a bronze plaque catches the morning light. Names of children lost in 1926 are etched there, each letter pressed into metal by hands that remembered. For generations, students have paused in that hallway, some tracing the names with their fingers, others reading them aloud during annual assemblies. The plaque is not hidden. Its presence is a quiet, daily lesson that disaster is not just a story, but a part of this place. Miss Ethel Graves, who survived the storm as a teacher, returned to the school decades later. She stood before crowds of children who listened as she described the moment when the sky roared and the ground fell away. Her voice, steady but distant, carried the weight of memory. She spoke of the unseen hooks, the force that lifted the building and changed everything in an instant. Bertie Cross Decker, a child then, grew old in La Plata. She gave interviews to local reporters, her recollections sharp as ever, the confusion, the cries, the way the town gathered itself after the wind had gone. Year after year, the story was told again, at school assemblies, on the anniversary, and in quiet conversations when storms rolled in from the west. The plaques at Summers became more than markers. They were a promise to remember, a way to carry forward the lessons of loss. Local newspapers ran features with black and white photos of the schoolhouse and the faces of those who did not come home. At town meetings, officials referenced the tragedy when debating sirens and drills, always with a sense that the past was never far away. In La Plata, memory lives not only in stone and metal, but in the words of those who endured. Even as new generations fill the classrooms, the echo of 1926 shapes how the town prepares, warns, and waits for thunder. The question lingers. If the sky darkens again, will remembering be enough? By late afternoon on April 28, 2002, the atmosphere over southern Maryland was primed for trouble. Warm, humid air at the surface clashed with cooler, drier currents aloft, creating sharp instability. Above, winds shifted direction and picked up speed with height, a setup meteorologists call wind shear. This combination is the classic recipe for supercells, the rotating thunderstorms that can spawn the most violent tornadoes. At the National Weather Service office in Sterling, Virginia, forecasters tracked the evolving situation through radar screens and satellite loops. Earlier that day, the Storm Prediction Center had issued a tornado watch for the region, alerting local offices that conditions could support tornado formation. Watches cover broad areas and long hours, putting everyone on notice, but rarely triggering immediate action. The real pressure comes with warnings, when a specific storm threatens a specific place. The supercell that would change La Plata's history began to organize just west of the Potomac. Its forward speed was unusual, nearly a mile a minute, around 58 miles per hour. That velocity compressed the window for detection and warning. As the cell crossed into Charles County, radar scans from Sterling showed a classic hook echo, a telltale sign of rotation. But the signal wavered, sometimes fading as the storm's low-level circulation slipped below the radar beam. The radar's lowest sweep, aimed thousands of feet above ground, missed the most dangerous part of the storm. On the ground, the threat was real, but, for precious minutes, partly invisible to the tools meant to spot it. Forecasters weighed imperfect data. Should they issue a tornado warning, or was a severe thunderstorm warning enough? At 6:45 p.m., a severe thunderstorm warning went out for Charles County, citing damaging winds and hail. But within minutes, ground reports filtered in. Spotters and emergency managers called in debris, damage, swirling clouds. The radar's hook intensified again. At 7:02 p.m., the tornado warning was issued for La Plata and surrounding areas. From that moment, the clock started ticking, with the storm racing east and the town's fate hanging on the urgency of those few minutes. Every second mattered, and every warning carried the weight of history. Inside the newsroom at WUSA 9, tension built as meteorologists watched the radar flicker between clarity and confusion. By early evening, the station's weather team faced a decision: break from regular programming and stay live, or risk missing the moment the storm turned deadly. They chose to remain on air, voices steady, updates constant. Every few minutes, anchors relayed warnings, tracked the cell's path, and urged viewers in Charles County to seek shelter. The broadcast logs from that night show a rare stretch of uninterrupted weather coverage, a choice that would later be credited with saving lives. Yet beyond the reach of television, the emergency alert system faltered. Of the radio stations tasked with relaying the tornado warning, nearly half failed to broadcast it in time. FCC investigators later traced the breakdown to faulty receivers, missed handoffs, and human error. In some neighborhoods, radios remained silent, leaving families unaware as the storm barreled closer. For those who relied on radio as their lifeline, the gap was invisible, but critical. Calls to the county's emergency operations centers spiked as confusion spread. Some heard the warning, others did not. Peggy Howard, an administrator at Archbishop Neal School, remembered the silence of that Sunday evening. The school, normally filled with children, stood empty. Hours later, she would walk the ruined halls, knowing that a weekday would have brought tragedy on a scale to rival the past. That near miss haunted her. Luck had intervened, not any system. In living rooms across La Plata, The difference between receiving the warning and missing it came down to the flicker of a TV, the click of a radio dial, or the absence of both. The storm's approach was relentless, its speed compressing the window for action. As WUSA 9's coverage continued, and as half the radios stayed silent, the town stood on the edge, some prepared, many unaware, waiting for what would happen next. At 7:10 p.m., the tornado reached the heart of La Plata. In less than 60 seconds, downtown was changed beyond recognition. The main street, once lined with brick storefronts and familiar shops, vanished beneath a wall of wind. The tornado had grown into a multi-vortex beast, several smaller funnels spinning inside the main circulation, each carving its own path of destruction. Witnesses described a roar so loud it drowned out every other sound, followed by a sudden, unnatural silence as the storm passed. The water tower, an icon on the skyline, collapsed in a tangle of steel. Its tank, ripped from the supports, crumpled and twisted, scattering metal across blocks. The town's fire station lost its roof. Businesses that had stood for generations were reduced to piles of brick and splintered wood. 65% of downtown was either flattened or left uninhabitable. The courthouse clock stopped at the exact minute the storm struck, its hands frozen in time above the ruined square. Inside the post office, workers dove beneath counters as windows exploded and walls buckled. Across the street, a grocery store lost its entire front wall, cans and produce sucked out into the street. Cars parked along Charles Street were tossed onto their sides or stacked against what remained of storefronts. In some places, the wind peeled asphalt from the roadbed, leaving bare earth exposed. Utility poles snapped in half, power lines whipped through the air, and transformers burst in blue-green flashes. For blocks, fire hydrants gushed into the chaos, flooding basements and mixing with broken glass and debris. Residents who took shelter in basements or interior rooms found themselves emerging into a landscape they did not recognize. The air was thick with dust and insulation, the only light coming from the fading evening sky and the flicker of emergency lights. People wandered the streets in shock, calling out for neighbors and family members, picking their way through overturned vehicles and tangled debris. The randomness of survival was everywhere. One house left standing, while the next was swept clean from its foundation. A single room intact amid total collapse. The damage pattern revealed the storm's complexity. In some spots, the tornado's multiple vortices had combined, amplifying the wind's force enough to strip homes to their slabs. In others, swirling winds spared a porch or a single tree, leaving behind a jarring contrast between devastation and untouched normalcy. The storm's violence was not uniform. It was selective, even cruel, sparing some corners while erasing others entirely. By the time the winds eased and the last vortex spun east, the core of La Plata was left in ruins. Downtown's familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by a raw, open wound. The physical destruction told a story not just of wind speed, but of how quickly a community's center can be erased. As night fell, the scale of the disaster was only beginning to register. The town's identity, its history, its gathering places, its sense of safety, had been torn apart in minutes. In the hours that followed, the human stories would begin to surface from the wreckage, each one shaped by the violence and randomness that had just swept through the heart of La Plata. Roy Hale stood in the center hallway of his home, listening to the windows rattle and the wind howl. The lights flickered, then died. Seconds later, the entire house shook as if lifted from its foundation. Roy remembers a sound like a freight train, but deeper, almost physical, pressing against his chest. In the chaos, the tornado's core split in two. One vortex veered left, the other right. And for reasons no one can explain, the walls around Roy and his wife remained standing. Everything else, roof, porch, the rooms at either end, was gone. He stepped out into a world stripped bare, sunlight pouring onto the ruins, the silence so complete it felt unreal. The tornado split, went around us, the roar. Then everything was gone except this little corner, Roy would tell reporters. Survival came down to seconds and inches. A few blocks away, the Clark family gathered in their bathroom as the siren sounded. 7 people, parents, children, a grandmother, crowded into the tub, clutching pillows and each other. The house shuddered, then lifted. Walls peeled away. For an instant, there was open sky above them, and debris spinning so fast it blurred. When the wind died, the house was gone. The tub, with all 7 still inside, sat exposed on the slab. They were bruised, cut, but alive. In the days that followed, neighbors called it the Clark Run miracle. The odds of all 7 surviving, together and conscious, seemed impossible. Yet there they were, dazed but whole, sitting amid the wreckage as emergency crews arrived. Not everyone was spared. William Erickson Jr. was found near the remains of his home, a place he had lived for decades. George and Margaret Alvey, married for more than 50 years, were together in their living room when the tornado struck. Both died instantly, their house erased down to bare concrete. Friends and family remembered them as pillars of the community, steady, generous, always ready to help. Their names joined the list of those lost, read aloud, at vigils, and etched into the town's memory. In each case, the violence was total, but the aftermath was marked by dignity. Neighbors searching, rescuers pausing to cover bodies, families gathering to mourn. The tornado did not stop at La Plata. It tore across fields and woods, crossed into Calvert County, and pressed on toward the eastern shore. In some places, it weakened, only to regain strength miles later, flattening homes and tossing cars like toys. The storm's reach extended for nearly 80 miles, making it one of the longest-lasting tornadoes in Maryland history. By the time the winds faded, 5 people were dead, more than 100 injured, and the economic toll had soared past $100 million. The randomness of destruction was everywhere. A home swept clean beside a mailbox left untouched. A family saved by a single interior wall. A bathtub anchored to nothing but luck. In the weeks after, survivors struggled to make sense of why some lived and others did not. Was it the speed of the warning, the strength of the shelter, or something that can't be measured? Stories like Roy Hale's and the Clark families became touchstones, proof that survival in a tornado can hinge on choices, timing, and forces beyond understanding. The questions that rose from the ruins would soon draw scientists, engineers, and policymakers to La Plata, searching for answers in the patterns of loss and the details of survival. Within minutes of the tornado's passing, La Plata's streets filled with headlights and voices. Emergency crews raced in from Charles County and beyond, but they weren't the first on scene. Neighbors began the search before the sirens stopped echoing. People dug through splintered walls with bare hands, calling out names, listening for any reply. Firefighters and police set up triage in parking lots. Stretchers lined up on pavement, still scattered with glass. The town's volunteer rescue squad, many of whom had lost homes themselves, worked without pause, ferrying the injured to the hospital. Phone lines jammed as families checked on loved ones. The town's only hospital, already running on backup power, took in a rush of patients. Cuts, broken bones, shock. Ambulances arrived from St. Mary's, Calvert, even Prince George's County, forming a steady convoy along Route 6. By midnight, more than 100 people had been treated for injuries. Some rescue teams worked through the night, moving slab by slab, searching for anyone trapped beneath the debris. Mutual aid poured in. Off-duty nurses showed up with medical bags. Local businesses handed out food and bottled water. Churches opened their doors for shelter. The Amish community, known for keeping to themselves, arrived with chainsaws and strong backs, clearing roads and helping strangers. By dawn, the first bulldozers were already pushing debris aside, making way for utility crews to restore power and water. Volunteers, teenagers, retirees, entire families formed bucket brigades, passing bricks and broken wood from hand to hand. In those first hours, the focus was simple: rescue, relief, comfort. There was no waiting for orders. People did what needed doing, guided by urgency and the memory of past storms. News outlets flashed the words, "Maryland's first F5," across the screen, but on the ground, the only thing that mattered was helping neighbors survive the night. Before debates over wind speed or engineering began, La Plata's resilience was already on display. In every act of aid, every voice calling into the darkness, every hand reaching through the rubble. Engineers walked the ruins of La Plata with clipboards and cameras, measuring the scars left behind. The first reports had called this an F5 tornado, the highest rating on the Fujita scale, winds supposedly over 260 miles per hour, a level of destruction almost no building could survive. Media headlines ran with it. For a brief moment, La Plata became the site of Maryland's first F5, a point of grim pride in the face of so much loss. But the science demanded a closer look. Tim Marshall, a structural engineer known for tornado forensics, led the team that inspected the worst of the damage. Their focus was not just what had vanished, but why. House after house, they found a pattern. Wood frames resting on concrete slabs, barely anchored or not at all. These so-called slider homes could be pushed or lifted by winds far less than what the F5 rating required. In some cases, homes had simply slid off their foundations, carried by the wind, while nearby debris, cars, mailboxes, even small trees, remained in place. What looked like the work of the strongest winds on E's was often the result of weak construction. Debris told its own story. Splintered boards pierced brick walls and metal siding, not always from direct wind, but from missiles hurled by the storm. The engineering team mapped these impacts, noting that much of the most dramatic destruction could be explained by flying debris, not just raw wind speed. The collapse of the water tower and the stripping of entire neighborhoods were extraordinary, but the evidence pointed to a mix of factors: construction flaws, debris impacts, and powerful, but not ultimate, winds. The final verdict arrived quietly: F4. The tornado's winds likely peaked just below the F5 threshold. For many in La Plata, this felt like an insult, a technicality that minimized their ordeal. Yet for meteorologists and engineers, accuracy mattered more than pride. Overstating wind speed could lead to overbuilt, unaffordable homes. Understating it could leave communities exposed. The lesson was clear: damage alone doesn't tell the whole story. How a building is put together, its ties to the ground, the strength of its walls, can mean the difference between survival and ruin. The old Fujita scale hadn't accounted for that. After La Plata, the system itself would have to change. After La Plata, the question was no longer whether the system needed to change, but how fast it could. Engineers and meteorologists gathered in conference rooms and field sites, sifting through the wreckage for answers. The old Fujita scale, built on the idea that the worst damage meant the highest winds, had missed a crucial piece: how buildings were put together. In La Plata, houses that looked obliterated had simply slid off their foundations, not because of record-breaking winds, but because they weren't anchored well enough to resist even a strong, but not ultimate, storm. That realization pushed the nation's top wind engineers, including Tim Marshall and Dr. Kishore Mehta, to design a new system. The Enhanced Fujita, or EF, scale was born from the need for accuracy. It went operational in February 2007, and for the first time, tornado ratings factored in not just what was destroyed, but how it was built and what it took to break it. The EF scale uses dozens of damage indicators, everything from mobile homes to schools to trees. each with levels of destruction tied to estimated wind speeds. Inspectors can now distinguish between a poorly built house swept away by lesser winds and a reinforced structure battered by the worst nature can deliver. La Plata's experience is cited in technical reports and policy memos as the turning point. The event that proved damage alone wasn't enough to judge a tornado's strength. Policy did not stop at science. Across Maryland, emergency managers and local officials overhauled warning systems. Outdoor sirens were installed throughout Charles County by 2003, designed to reach people even when radios or phones failed. The county's Emergency Operations Center was upgraded to ensure direct, real-time communication with the National Weather Service. Schools began regular tornado drills, and new buildings went up with stricter codes and anchoring requirements. In the years that followed, wireless emergency alerts, those sudden alarms on cell phones, became standard, closing gaps that left so many unwarned until 2002. Today, La Plata's warning ecosystem is built on redundancy: sirens, radios, phone alerts, and social media, all working together to make sure that no single point of failure can silence the alarm again. The lessons learned in one town now shape how the entire country prepares for the next storm. On the afternoon of September 7, 2021, dark clouds swept over Annapolis. In less than 15 minutes, a tornado cut a path more than 11 miles long, tearing roofs from homes and flipping cars. Sirens blared, phones buzzed with wireless emergency alerts, and police cruisers moved through neighborhoods with loudspeakers. In Parole, where the damage was worst, over 100 buildings were battered, some left uninhabitable, trees snapped, power lines down. Yet when the winds faded and the debris settled, not a single life was lost. No one was killed, and no one suffered critical injury. Local officials credited the outcome to something simple but hard-won. Everyone had time to act. The warnings arrived by every channel: sirens, phones, television, and social media, giving residents those precious minutes to shelter in place. This was not luck. After-action reports from county emergency managers, the National Weather Service, and the Maryland Emergency Management Agency all pointed to the same reason: the reforms born out of La Plata. The system that failed so many in 2002 had been rebuilt from the ground up. Redundant alerts, regular tornado drills in schools, and a culture of readiness had become the new normal. The Annapolis tornado became proof that the lessons of La Plata were not just theory, they saved lives. In La Plata itself, reminders of what was lost and what was learned are woven into the town's daily life. On the town green, a memorial garden sits quietly beside the main street. Its pathway is lined with bricks bearing the names of survivors and those who helped rebuild. At the entrance, a 5-pointed star sculpture rises from the earth, its metal catching the morning sun. The base reads, "La Plata strong, in darkness we found stars." Each spring, families gather here to remember the storms of 1926 and 2002. Names are read aloud, stories are retold, and new generations hear how the town endured, rebuilt, and changed. The memorial is more than a tribute. It is a living promise that memory, science, and community will stand guard together. La Plata's fury became the catalyst for a safer future, not just for itself, but for towns across the country. The evidence is clear. Lives are saved, and hope endures. On April 28, 2002, the La Plata tornado traveled 78 miles in just 79 minutes, destroying over 860 homes and 194 businesses, and leaving 5 people dead. The evidence showed that while the tornado's force was extreme, structural weaknesses made the devastation worse, prompting the revision of the National Tornado Rating System. Yet, not every question has an answer. We still cannot predict exactly who will be in the path, or why some survive when others do not. What is clear is that La Plata's pain led to real change. The enhanced Fujita scale was adopted in 2007, and new alert systems now reach more people than ever before. When an EF2 tornado struck Annapolis in 2021, not a single life was lost, a testament to lessons learned. The record stands. La Plata's experience changed how America warns and builds, and those changes continue to save lives.